Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session of DuPont Summit 2024. Our first session is delivered by Chris Demchak. She is a professor and Harper Chair of Cyber University from U.S. Naval War College, and she holds engineering, economics, and political science analysis degrees. Let's welcome Dr. Chris Demchak.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I've been asked today to come and talk about what we haven't learned over the last 10, 15, and 20 years of being in a cybered world and working with cyberspace. And I'm going to give a talk today that sort of draws upon my basic, what I call systems analysis, socio-technical economic systems approach. And a lot of the material is updated from a piece I wrote with Francesca Spitaglieri a couple of years ago for the Cyber Defense Review. So I'm going to take the points we made about what lessons we didn't learn, and then I'm going to expand upon them today. So let's get started. One of the nicest lines that I've heard over time about cyber, I attribute this to Dr. Emily Goldman, who works for the US Cyber Command. And I believe she's the one that said that what it was doing is it was shaping the world 1,000 servers at a time, but persistently. And I think the most important thing to look at is how this substrate that invaded all of our society has changed things in ways that we're not looking at. We're either ignoring them, or we're mistaken about these changes, or we've simply missed them despite the evidence and the experience that we've had. Finally, we see them, but we don't do anything about it. Right? So I want to give first a rundown of those mistakes. First one, cyberspace. Well, what's not known about by most people is how badly coded it was from the very beginning. It was coded fast. It was coded in C, C++, and these are forgiving languages that allow you to leave mistakes in your program that somebody else can later on come and hack. This is not this is ignored, actually, is probably one of the better things to say about it. Although lately people have been noticing it. One of the other things that we just simply mistook was that this poorly coded substrate gave 5 offense advantages basically to everyone. For now, anyone could have a scale of an organization worthy of attacking other people using infected computers. You could be at any proximity, that is to say, any distance from someone else, and attack them. You could use a set of tools. You weren't tied to just one because you could afford that one. No, you had a whole range of tools you could use against a range of targets. You could hide those tools so that people couldn't quite know what hit them or ever figure out what you were taking. And of course, finally, you could hide yourself. And that meant that you could act with impunity. The other thing that we haven't noticed or we mistook was that it changed the sources of surprise for our digitized nations. From the beginning, a large, complex, single enterprise always had rogue outcomes and surprises, right? It was a complex system. It was going to have them. Then when you connect those systems together, you have even more complex problems when they go down. But now, with the advent of this badly coded substrate seeping underneath our societies, we now have this entire globe of bad actors able to reach in and do malicious things, and a subset of them, which we call, or my colleagues and I call, the wicked actors, otherwise they're also called as advanced persistent threats and so on, who are really scary good at this. And they can reach in even more deeply. And the difference between the two groups is profound. The first group wants money. They could be deterred. They could be sent off to someplace else. But the second group is persistent. It means to be where it is. It's being paid by some state or large wealthy organization, and they do not give up. The fourth thing is the losses. For most of the history of cyberspace, Most governments, most policies have treated the theft of IP as, well, just another criminal act. You know, that's what law enforcement is for. I didn't add it up until the beginning of the 2010s. And then we started to have actual research that showed that for the consolidated democracies in particular, this could be 1 to 2% of their GDP losses associated with cyber insecurity. And this isn't sustainable in the long run. And you know, the easiest way to destroy a democracy is to destroy its economy. Look at the 1930s. And these democratic socio-technical economic systems bound together by cyberspace now have been open to these bad actors for now, what, 30 years? Right? The other thing it did is it began to accelerate the returns of scale and strategic coherence of major adversaries. So it's not your grandfather's world in a really big way. This is a different, competitive, often malicious cyber exploitation. And from the westernized consolidated democracies point of view, especially from China, and I meant to add Russia to that line. Finally, in this particular mistaken category, is the lack of realization until recently that this has created a different kind of conflict in the world. We call it a cyber conflict, right? And what it has done is it's changed the character of national power. It's added cyber power as a key element of national power, but not just the ability to reach out and do something offensive to someone. It's also how systemically resilient your society is to the malicious acts that will come at you, right? That's cyber power, and it is critical to national power today. Now I want to talk a little bit about the lessons that were missed or simply not absorbed. We saw it, we saw the evidence, we saw it, but we didn't do much about it. Or we mistook it, right? So we talked about the rise of cyber conflict. Once that cyber conflict has distributed itself across countries that have bordered their own cyberspace, then you have large countries competing over the rules of cyberspace across the world and global economic dominance across these bordered cyber territories. You have great systems conflict, right? And the great systems conflict, the interesting thing is it's not great systems war, it is conflict. And it is more than a mere competition because there's much malicious activity that goes on. And it stretches from peace to war. So in the US military, they call this the gray zone before you actually start shooting at each other. But there are others who have called it unpeace. Kellogg calls it unpeace, for example. But this large spectrum, we're competing all the way along that large spectrum as great systems because we have the resources and we certainly have the intent. Another one of the lessons that we had difficulty learning was that we've spent over 2 decades diplomatically trying to use cyber norms to control behaviors across this particular space. And what we've failed to do is to get any binding norms. That diplomacy basically has produced norms without enforcement. And there's this literature out there that will tell you that people are observing the norms generally. But the difficulty is that this is a spectrum. And what we find, for example, in the Russian-Ukrainian war, that observation, however those norms may or may not have had some influence when people weren't firing things at, that doesn't matter and doesn't account for what's going on today, right? And of course, the difficulty is the consolidated democracies have yet to come to grip with the fact that they don't have leverage over most of the people who would be making decisions to use, to simply ignore those norms. Major strategic failure in accurately assessing China's strategic trajectory. I argue that it is because we did not understand that when China came out of its particular cocoon, and join the rest of the world, it would not take long for a node in the global system, a node in that system of that size to not have the influence that China has today. Right? And we also mistakenly assumed that the rule of law, liberal economic international system was simply so cemented into the world that China would have to join it and observe its rules, which it has not done. And so this was seeable. History could have told us that the Chinese might have a different opinion, but we did not see it. And we didn't adequately prepare for the vulnerabilities that we now have in digital governance and in trade. Right? And we have 9 of these lessons, so this is just the 4th one. We mistook resilience to simply be good cyber hygiene in your laptop, and then having the government occasionally defend some parts of government networks. We did not fully understand that national cyber resilience had to be a whole of society resilience. There are a couple of states that did, Finland for one of them, for example, Estonia, particularly after the 2007 attack. But the big ones, not particularly, did not understand this is a systemic issue, and you have to deal with it that way across your society. And the second part was you have to have some offensive capabilities. Now you have to actually reach out and meet the adversary somewhere outside of your networks. And the two of them are required for systemic socio-technical economic resilience. You have to have a balance of those two in order to move on. Another lesson, we know this, we've known this for years, but we didn't apply it to cyberspace. And that was our allies are critical. They're critical for lots of reasons today, but particularly for operational resilience, right? You can't defend alone. You never could defend alone, particularly small consolidated democracies. But it's even true for the United States, because we don't have the scale. When I say scale, I mean in population scale, because we're up against a major adversary, China, that actually says its rightful place in the world is at the center. Why? Because of its population size. And none of the consolidated democracies are at that size. Even the EU is a quarter. The US is approximately 5th, right? So no one is at the size. And so we have an actor that is assuming it needs to tell the rest of us how to operate. The only way we're going to get peer deference is if we bring our allies in, not simply for the weight they bring to the fight, if you will, or to the I don't mean fight, I mean conflict, but to the knowledge they bring, because we have allies that are as digitized, are as knowledgeable, are as well educated, and there's no particular reason why we shouldn't have them inside the tent working operationally with us. Another one that we haven't learned we're learning, we keep talking about public-private partnership, but we don't really do it, is that the role of the private sector cannot be on its own trying to make peace, as Microsoft has attempted to do a couple of times and so on. It has to be inside the defense tent. It has to understand that it is playing a key role in the defense of democratic IT. And until Ukraine, it's hard to argue that they would do that. There was a lot of discussion saying, no, they'll have to be paid, therefore they won't care. But they ponied right up when Ukraine was attacked. The thing is that we cannot wait for that to happen, and we're already being attacked. So we need to have a more organized way to get them involved. And that, in fact, is part of what I will bring, I'll make a suggestion at the end of the talk. Persistent engagement, that is a lesson from the Cold War that we have only begun to adapt in the last 6 or 7 years in the United States. I cannot speak for what's happening, particularly in amongst the rest of our allies. Some yes, some no. One has to assume that the adversary and those wicked actors are going to be present all the time, everywhere. As soon as an avenue in, access is everything. As soon as an avenue in opens up, they will find it. They're always looking for it. So this kind of a persistent engagement strategy is absolutely essential part of having cyber power, both on the resilience side and on the forward defense side. This seems like an obvious one, right? The need for systemic basics. It says 9 lessons, but I think I only have 8 because I combined them. So no, I haven't forgotten one. Metrics. Of course we need metrics, right? We need to know what works and what doesn't work. But my argument here is a little bit more specific. In the United States in particular, not in other countries, and I couldn't say exactly in other countries. In the United States, we get what we want in terms of consistent decisions by much of our society in systemic terms because of insurance. So everyone knows about fire codes, right? Right, but there's other things. There's cars. You know, we require you have insurance. Insurance companies don't want to pay out. So they require you have functioning brakes, that sort of thing, right? The problem with cyber insurance is it is available. It's not required, right, for anybody particularly. Well, I think the SEC has some rules on it, but most small and medium businesses don't, you know, and it's very expensive. So this is an ideal place where a public cyber insurance would do a great deal to actually improve that sort of, you know, endpoint edge sort of resilience, you know, much like our financial system. We have something called the FDIC that it serves this kind of purpose. We know this. We need this. It's still not a thing. Right? And we need to recognize that people will do to protect themselves if they know how to do it and they know where to get the tool to do it. So that's another thing we could be providing, just some basics we could be providing nationally and should be systemically, right? And finally, there's a great, I'm not sure, and I hope it's not too late, but there's a great shedding of all analog systems over the last 20 years. Why? Not because the analog system didn't do something that kept something working, but because it wasn't fast enough, it was inefficient to maintain, it was old looking, you know, there's a new way to do it, push of a button rather than a turn of a wheel, etc. But the difficulty is if your shoddy cyber substrate is under attack, you need to have some of those analog systems around. And so one of the things we need to have done and could have thought this through, is to, in fact, incentivize updating analog systems. I'm mindful of the fact that one of the analog, it's not analog specifically. Well, I guess it is. You can think of it that way. We have, we have old lines, telephone lines, right? And the telephone companies got rid of them. Why? Because they're expensive, they're hard to maintain, and so on, so on. It's much easier to just do it over the airways. The problem is if the cell phone tower goes down, everybody goes down, right? Yes, it was always true that if the switching station went down, the same thing would happen, but the lines were wired. And that meant that even in heavy snowfalls, even if your electricity's out, which I live in the Northeast, happens, you could still communicate. So the old systems, actually, there's a role and there's a resilience requirement in our view for that as well. There's 9. This is about AI. This is a lesson about new technologies. They always come with a hype. They always come with a recommendation that they are going to save you. And so this has been a hard lesson for us to learn. I'm not sure it's learned, actually. I would argue it's not learned yet. And that is that, yes, they will add, they will make a contribution, but they cannot change a fundamental problem if they are cyber's offspring. So AI cannot fix its parent. AI can't fix the cruddy coding of the fundamental internet. Instead, what will happen is that coding, that poor, sloppy construction will feed right into your AI programs. And one of the ways you see this is articles coming out now about how you can have poison data, poison models. These are all things that we've known for a long time in cyberspace. And so the insecurity of this parent cyberspace feeds over into the insecurities of the AI, your clouds, all of those things. You need to work your way back. If you're going to integrate those technologies, you're going to have to work on fixing the underlying substrate. Right? Now here, those are the lessons I updated from that particular article, but I want to talk a little bit about what are the fundamentals that caused us to miss those lessons. And one of the absolute biggest fundamentals was a very big lack of understanding of what cyberspace's structure actually is. And this is a picture. It's a little bit dated that I've been using for years, or 10 years basically, because it helps people understand what we're actually dealing with. Yes, cyberspace is coded. Yes, the connections are with networks and things you'd rather not know about or see, but there is a structure behind this system that if you don't know and you make policy decisions or you assume someone's taking care of things, your lack of understanding and that of policymakers is what allows adversaries to actually step in and exploit. So it's very technical, but it is not free. It is peer or pay. Let's look at this for a moment. So if you look down where you see the gray area, that's you. That's where all of us are. And you communicate up and, you're going through your routers, you're going through your modem, you have your firewall, you go up to an ISP, which is an internet service provider. You pay for that. And then at the ISP, they go up through a second tier and they go through an exchange. Now, an internet exchange, the best way to think about it is a huge warehouse with a ton of servers in there, after another row after row, array after array of servers in there. And your traffic is contractually put through into some server or another, and that server is owned by some company, and when that company rents some of those servers, it's called a point of presence, a POP, and their job is to push all of that traffic up, and everyone wants to get it to what's called the backbone. And these are the servers run by the major telecommunications corporations, like a Verizon, France Orange, and so on. Now, between them, up to that moment, everybody pays. Now, between Verizon and the France Orange is an agreement, and they will peer their data across. And if they're peering it across, it doesn't cost all the other people any money. So financially, the first thing you want to do is get your traffic up there and have it travel all the way over on these long distances for free, basically for you. And then it pays on the way down as well. Perfect, no? But the difficulty is, if you don't understand how that works, then you also don't understand how someone can manipulate it. And let's show you an example. This is some work I did a couple of years ago with Yuval Shavit of Tel Aviv University. And what we're looking at is these points of presence. Now, what guides the points of presence in the internet is a telephone book, if you will. It's called the Border Gateway Protocol, a BGP. And the BGP is a list of routes. So you could send your traffic this way, or you could send your traffic that way. You could send it another way. Remember, what you want to do is you want to get it up to that backbone, save money, and then drop it down again. Right? That's your route. You configure a route. You send not one piece of traffic, it's not like a letter. You send packets across all that route. And it hits these points of presence. In principle, they should just pass it through up to the backbone. But what if they don't? What if they want a copy of your traffic? Well, let's look at what happens if you don't understand this. So in 2018, when we first published on this, China Telecom had at least 10 points of presence in strategic places across North America. And this is what particularly Yuval and his team started seeing in their research. So this is the Canadian government sending something to the Korean government for 6 months. Remember, this is just once. This is not a misconfiguration. Oh, look at that, wrong way. Fix. No, this is a deliberate hijacking. And it hit a China Telecom POP, and it didn't go up to the backbone. It went to another China Telecom POP, should be noted here in California, and then it went to China, not to Korea, went to China, floated around in China, and then showed up in Korea. Now, why didn't the Korean government realize this? Why didn't the Canadian government realize this? Because we are talking 6 months, tons of traffic going out all the time. And the way the traffic at the moment, the way you can tell is it just lists all the little nodes it went through. If you're not looking for Chinese nodes in that list, you won't see them. And in fact, this has happened until 2018. People were surprised when they read our research. Here's another good example. This is traffic being sent from Japan. It should go through Singapore to UAE. Instead, it hits a China Telecom POP in Japan, never makes it up, goes over to a China Telecom POP in California, then goes through China, and then goes to UAE. Here's another one. I happen to like this one because this one is particularly odd. This is a bank that started in Houston. Was supposed to go through a New York exchange to France and then to Italy. Instead, hit a China Telecom POP, was not pressed where it's supposed to go. It went to another one in California, went to China, and actually never arrived. Our tracking was like, well, it never went anywhere from China. We don't know what the bank did. That was just another example. So that was what we published in 2018. We updated in 21. And this time we were looking at Trans Telecom. And we found similar sorts of hijacking where your traffic for a considerable period of time goes through either Moscow or someplace in China, and then it finally gets to where it's supposed to go after presumably someone's taking a copy of it. So in this particular case, this particular traffic was supposed to go down to South Africa. And for reasons that we're not sure, well, it's the way the networks are set up. It goes to Germany first, and then it should have gone down to South Africa, but it instead went to Germany, was deflected into Moscow, and then sent back down to South Africa. Here's another one. Also, this one was out of Israel. It was supposed to go over here, and I think it's this to Milan, and should have gone to Frankfurt and down. Instead, it was deflected to Moscow because it hit a Trans Telecom POP. And we have yet another one where it went from Germany, from Frankfurt, headed to Berlin, deflected through Moscow and back off. Okay. So if you don't know how this system is set up, someone's reading your traffic, right? And in our particular research we published on, we were focused on China Telecom, and it has at least 2,500 of these POPs all around the world. So everywhere that you're not paying attention, this is possible. Well, let's sort of capture this very quickly in the last few minutes that I have around. So what we have that we're not being aware of is what we call a cyber conflict vicious cycle, right? Where access starts everything. And access starts with those 5 offense advantages that were poorly coded into this underlying substrate. And that leads us to these sources of systemic surprise. We added the bad actors and the wicked actors, leaving us with weak systemic resilience and weak forward defense. And that means that all of us are dealing with being basically weak cyber powers. We haven't made that balance between systemic resilience and our forward offense. And we lose 1 to 2%. Someone wrote 6%. I put it up there as well. So what are our government trying to do? They're trying to do something. You can see that. We have the GDPR, the US, well known for our cyber command, right? But the difficulty is those layers of the internet. As democracies, we don't want to control all of the internet. So we float around down here trying to catch them in the connectivity part, but the cycle just continues. Okay? So what we haven't learned over these many years is how to break into that cycle. And why does it matter? Well, it matters because at the moment, China in a year graduates more computer scientists than the US does in all of STEM. Its scale is absolutely astounding compared to any one of the individual democracies. And it's not going away. It never was going to go away. You cannot contain China. You have to learn how to deal with an adversary that's permanently ensconced in your global system. Another thing that's happening is clouds. The work that Yuval and I did was possible because we could buy, or not we, but his team could buy space on servers, and we could see things going through. But clouds have become the go-to, and particularly for security. The problem is they're almost all private clouds. Those private companies have no obligation to tell law enforcement or government who they hire, how they've coded it, where they're storing the data. I mean, other than somewhere in the United States, for example, or somewhere in France, for example. Who's allowed, what nodes they're going through, right? Who's adjacent to that node? What buckets are beside each other in that node? They have no obligation to tell any of that. And they're reaching down to the last mile. So this isn't getting any better. It's getting more obscure, and it's still resting on this incredibly insecure cyberspace. So for us, a very burning question is yet to be answered as well. How do minority states survive? How do each of us survive as prosperous democratic systems? And you note I haven't addressed the abuses of social media yet. That's quite another question. In an authoritarian, dominant, or centric, digitized world. Well, I argue, and this is research that I'm continuing, that we have to have a different narrative. We have to recognize, the minority group of states that are consolidated democracies as a minority community, and that we have to collectively have an answer. And that answer has to be operational resilience, right? And so we have to bring that cyber operational resilience to all of these states. And that will take 3 goals. The first one is we got to scale up. There's a thing in history that it's sometimes called this and sometimes not. It's called peer deference. The United States had peer deference with the Soviet Union. Not in the United States alone, it was the United States and NATO had peer deference with the Soviet Union. That meant something. It meant, okay, we won't do that to you because we know you can do that to us, right? Right? They actually deferred doing things, right? It doesn't happen with an adversary like China because remember, they feel they're entitled to a central role in the world because of their population. Well, the only way these consolidated democracies are going to have that level of population is if you scale up together. And we've done it before. We have actually done it. We have worked together operationally. NATO, we do an EU, OECD. We have ways to bring things together, and we need to bring not only our allies in, but their private sector, telecommunications, IT, capital goods. We need to buy time. We thought that the Chinese GDP would not match the US until the late 2030s. And the Chinese didn't think it would happen until 2049. But there's a good argument in using PPP version of the GDP metrics, that it happened in 2014, right? Already higher than we are. We need to buy time now. So we need to get those private sector firms actively defending critical forms of democratic IT. Now, until Ukraine happened, I didn't think they'd be willing to do it. I didn't think it would be easy, but we have seen that they will, in fact, step up to the bar when it's necessary. The question is, do they have the narrative to make it necessary? And I'm not, that one we're working on. It doesn't mean that we are isolating ourselves and we're buying time, actively defending this. No, we're trading vigorously. But for example, there are no foreign POPs in China, and that's for a reason. And so my argument would be there would be no foreign POPs in the democratic allies of Akora. Right? So all the POPs would be ours in those states. It's something that could be done. It could be talked about. It could be thought about. Right? Finally, the third operational goal, absolutely essential one, you have to invest massively in advanced IT for the purposes of reconstructing and upgrading the current cruddy underlying substrate to make it what we meant it to be: safe, innovative, democratic internet, right? Not an open access point for bad and wicked actors. This is the only way we're going to match what we consider the Chinese model. And the only way we're going to actually, extract peer deference and literally and deterrence from someone like China and also Russia, right? So this is what it looks like in our vicious cycle. Basically, we are working with our telecommunications corporations down here. Here, we're working with the IT capital goods sector to actually change these offense advantages. That in turn changes what our resilience, systemic resilience looks like in our forward defense. And that's the core. That's how we work it out. So, great systems conflict today, the lesson we have to learn is that there's no assured future for us, for democracies in these deeply cyber authoritarian world. If we don't hang together, as Ben Franklin said, we will most certainly hang separately. I'm happy to answer questions and fill in any holes, and you can follow up and drop me an email if you like as well.
Thank you, Chris. If anyone have any question, you can text them in chat box or using Q&A section. We have two questions from John. The first is, what emerging technology do you think are most likely to influence the future of cyber conflicts?
At the moment, it's clearly AI. It's clearly, it's the go-to. Now, generative AI is the variation of AI, and everybody wants some of that AI pixie dust. So people are pursuing it, even if they have no idea that what it truly is statistical. It's statistically based, plausible outcomes. And so there's a long conversation we could have about how it can lead you slowly astray, but not obviously, just slowly astray. I think it's going to be, and is, a great tool. I'm not opposed to it at all. I think we have to understand it as cyber's offspring, that it can be corrupted, it can be confused, and you use it with that in mind. And there's fundamental understanding when you do systems analysis, surprise and systems analysis. So one of the fundamental understanding is redundancy is a great thing. It may be inefficient, it costs you a bit more, but redundancy is lovely because redundant systems will give you different pictures and you'll understand how those statistical outcomes may vary. And that's where you come in to say, okay, I choose this and not that.
Okay, sounds great. The second question is also from John. He wonders if you have any thought about how governments, especially liberal democracy, can balance national security interests with individual privacy concerns when developing cybersecurity policies.
Well, that's a big one. I have to tell you that about 10 years ago, actually, now that I think about it, 15, get on. A colleague and I wrote some pieces on what we call behavior-based privacy. And one of the things that we were particularly interested in a digitized world was how you could chase bad behavior and yet not ensnarl good people in that chase. And we decided that there were three things that were needed. One was a tailored anonymity. So we would not walk around with my name plastered all over all my cards and everything else. We would, Mickey Mouse 123. I would have my own my anonymity, but it would be kept by a third party, and we would shard the data. We had a lot of technical answers on why that would be hard to steal. But we also then you had a public aspect that if I went and I bought milk consistently, and I like this particular kind of milk, it was okay for the third parties that were supervising Mickey Mouse 123 credit card. It was okay for them to sell, this is how much milk is bought in this town and so on. So you could still accommodate business interests to know how things were going. But there was a third thing we never saw anyone else talk about, and that was called validation and appeal. And so we were writing this at the end of the war on terror. And I don't know if you remember, but at the time, there were this secret list running around of people who weren't allowed to fly, and nobody knew who owned it. Nobody knew who put it together. But if you were on that list, you were not getting on a plane in the United States. And so this was insane to us. And so validation and appeal, and we had times and dates, and we said, if you tell me that I am not the person that is on this particular card, show me how you can validate that, and that you still won't let me on the plane or whatever I'm not allowed to do, then a certain period of time I have to appeal. And again, a response has to be within a certain period of time. I don't see that even in any privacy recommendations today. And for us, VNA was absolutely critical to make any of these systems work. So my long-winded way of answering is that that's what I see we're going to have to do.
Okay, next question is from Charles. Given the vulnerability of centralized system using cyber as you described, how important do you see the need for decentralized system that can operate in island mode, whether communication or energy systems such as microgrids?
Absolutely. Segmentation is incredibly important. And this is another one of those lessons that didn't travel particularly well all the time. When you're an engineer and you've got a multi-source failure, the first thing you do is you start closing things off and parsing them, right? So that you can see, and you put sensors everywhere to see what's traveling around systems, so you can see where these failures are coming from, assuming they're not ephemeral. Segmentation is important. We call that graceful decoupling. And that it means that you decouple to the lowest self-sufficient entity, whatever that is. You couple up for speed, for efficiency, and so on, but resilience requires that you can gracefully decouple. So how do I feel about it? It's essential, absolutely essential.
Okay, and the last question is, might it be good idea for the US security establishment to approach China in a more cooperative way rather than adversarial approach towards the global cybersecurity issue?
Look, we have done. That was what we were doing from 2000 to 2018. Very, like, look, you really can't do this. You shouldn't be doing that. This is not a good idea. And the Chinese would go, you are accusing us of things that, no, you can't prove that we've done that. And they didn't stop. 2015, President Obama signed an agreement with the Chinese, and they waited about 4 months before they went back to the same level. So I think that's why I argue we don't have peer deference. The Soviet Union, when we would go to them and they would back off, they would not lose face. They would back off like tomorrow, but they'd back off doing things because they understood peer deference. We do not have that with China. When we say going to a more cooperative way, their response is, okay, show us exactly how you found us in that network, So what they want to know is what mistakes they won't make again. So I don't, at the moment, we have a state, a large node in a system who believes it is entitled to be the central state in the system. That is a grievance. That is a grievance level that is extremely difficult to talk them out of, because then they feel like you're taking something from them. And that gives me not a good feeling about the future unless we are prepared and resilient against whatever they just decide is necessary for their rise to the center.
Okay, thank you, thank you. There's no more question, and we will end this session. The next session will begin in 4 minutes. Thank you,
All right.
Chris, and we will see you soon. Bye bye.
Cheers.